Her husband sent a rusty wreck to pick her up at the airport while buying an expensive necklace for his mistress. But he had a surprise waiting for him. My father would be proud of me now. He used to say he couldn't imagine how I'd manage the business. The plane carrying Eva Clark home was just about to land. She was in a great mood. The business meeting had gone well, and she had handled everything herself. She managed to close a lucrative deal with investors, ensuring the continued growth of her chain of stores. Let the gossips be disappointed, things hadn't gone downhill after her father's passing a few years ago. Not a chance. Eva sighed, acknowledging there was a shred of truth in the local rumors. Her husband, Ronald, was more of a decorative figure. Tall, handsome, with strikingly model-like blonde hair and blue eyes, Ronald wasn't exactly cut out for business. He loved nothing more than joking, socializing, and entertaining others. Some claimed he married the short, slightly chubby, brown-eyed brunette solely for her money and never intended to contribute to the family business. But Eva didn't believe that. She saw Ronald for who he truly was, a simple country boy without experience or education, but someone who genuinely tried his best. She believed in him, hoping that, with time, he'd grow into the role. Her father had spent years teaching her the ropes, and eventually, she succeeded. I get it. People see me as a wealthy heiress and Ronald as a freeloading accessory. You can't stop people from talking. They're just jealous. I shouldn't let it bother me, Eva reassured herself as she disembarked from the plane. She scanned the parking lot for the business-class vehicle she had asked her husband to arrange. Ronald knew she wouldn't be alone. She was expecting to pick up partners Steve and Paul. She'd emphasized how crucial this was, and she was sure he'd take it seriously. Ronald, hi. I don't see the car you sent. The partners will be here soon. Is something wrong? Eva barely managed to reach her husband. The reception was poor at the airport. Eva, well, there's been an issue. They tricked me at the last minute. Instead of the business car I ordered, they sent me some kind of junk heap. You know I'm terrible at this kind of thing, always trusting people. I'm so sorry, my love. Ronald mumbled something vague about ordering a top-tier vehicle but ending up with a budget taxi. How could this happen? Why didn't you go to the car service yourself, like I asked? You knew how important this was to me. Eva stepped into the parking lot and located the car by its license plate. It wasn't even budget class, it was several notches below. The car looked like it was overdue for the scrapyard, its paint peeling away to reveal rust underneath. Oil dripped steadily, emitting a pungent smell that lingered in the air. Eva, forgive me, but remember, you didn't tell me about your father's business right away either. I told you from the start I'm not cut out for these business meetings. Ronald, as always, hit her where it hurt. Whenever he made a mistake, he'd remind Eva how she had practically tricked him into marriage. And, as usual, she had no real retort, since there was a kernel of truth in his accusation. Eva stood in front of the rusty heap that was somehow still drivable. Her face turned pale, and her knees felt weak. She could already picture herself explaining to the two sharply dressed businessmen, men whose watches cost more than this car, that this was just an exotic twist. She'd have to convince them the company was thriving. Oh, sure, like they'd believe that. While Eva stared blankly at the car, Ronald breathed a sigh of relief, feeling he'd successfully wriggled out of the situation. He'd been worried for a moment but managed to pull it off. There was no way he could admit the truth. He had spent the money set aside for the car rental on a necklace for Julie. Julie, pure enchantment. An ethereal, slender, tall beauty with delicate curls, a swan-like neck, and almost ballerina-like grace. If anyone deserved to wear that elegant gold necklace, it was her. On Eva, it would look like a saddle on a cow. His wife would be better suited in rubber boots with a pail of milk on a farm. By some strange twist of fate, Eva had become a businesswoman. She might be young, healthy, and not unattractive, but that was about it. Julie, on the other hand, was a stunning miracle. She deserved every cent. It was money well spent on his mistress. Ronald had hesitated at first when Julie asked for such an expensive gift, but he found a way. He lied to Eva, saying the car rental required payment for the whole day and that a deposit was needed. She believed him. Then he made up a story about the driver needing to wear a suit, even though Eva, naive as she was, questioned it. Surely a business-class car rental came with a properly dressed driver? Ronald insisted it didn't. Busy with her ridiculous deal, Eva transferred the money without a word. That's how Ronald scraped together enough for the necklace. Now Julie believed he was a successful businessman, the man of her dreams. Ronald would never admit that he was just an accessory to his wife. He lied to Julie, claiming he supported his clueless wife. The whole town knew it was the other way around, but Julie either didn't know or pretended not to. It didn't matter. Ronald was grateful for the way she made him feel like a real man, something Eva never did, even though she never demeaned him outright. Around her, he felt like nothing more than a servant. He knew her employees mocked him, calling him a fool and joking that all his blessings went to his looks, leaving nothing for his brains. Ronald felt no guilt. He simply didn't have any money left. That's when Andy came into the picture. Andy was an old friend from their taxi driving days. His wife had left him, and he was raising a daughter alone, trying to save for her surgery. Vicky, a gymnast, had fallen and broken her spine, a family tragedy. Andy told Ronald about his grueling work schedule and how their taxi service barely paid anything. The cars were falling apart, but he had no choice. He applied for a medical grant for Vicky's operation, but nothing was guaranteed. He worked day and night to ensure he'd have the money when the time came. When Andy mentioned the taxi service rates, Ronald was thrilled. It was just enough to cover what he had left. He didn't think those meager savings could buy anything. And what was wrong with helping out Andy's family while hiring him to pick up Eva at the airport? Everything was in order. Ronald paid in advance. True, they didn't offer a discount, even though he specifically requested the worst car. They should have given him a break. But no matter. He could have sent no car at all, but Ronald wasn't that kind of scoundrel. He knew how hard it was to get a taxi in their city, so he took care of it. It might not have been business class, but at least Eva wouldn't have to walk. And honestly, a little reminder of how ordinary people lived wouldn't hurt her. Ronald glanced at his phone, seeing several missed calls from Eva. He shrugged dismissively. So stubborn, he muttered. Why couldn't she just accept the situation and ride in the carriage, or rather, the pumpkin, that had arrived for her? No need to keep pestering him. He wasn't stupid enough to pick up and start apologizing again. She'd forgive him eventually. Eva was the forgiving type. Right now, though, it was better to avoid talking to her. Why won't he answer? Eva said in frustration to the taxi driver. I'd like to help, but I didn't know I'd be meeting business people. Someone prepaid for the ride. You have to understand, I'm not involved in this, Andy explained, clarifying he hadn't personally interacted with the person who booked the ride. What a cheapskate. Eva muttered angrily when Andy mentioned that the person had also asked for a discount. This is exactly his style. He spends money where he shouldn't and pinches pennies where it actually matters. Maybe he was trying to do something nice for you? Thought it'd work out, Andy suggested, trying to console her as he listened to her story. He felt uneasy seeing the look of distress on her face. I don't know what to think anymore, Eva sighed, waving toward two impeccably dressed men waiting nearby. They waved back, their expressions polite but curious. It's too late now, they're expecting me. Look, let's make the best of it, Andy said, trying to lift her spirits. Sometimes life throws you a curveball, and you just have to smile through it. Play along, and I'll back you up. Steve and Paul approached with bemused smiles, casting skeptical glances at Eva, Andy, and the beat-up car. One of them quipped, "Is this your way of testing how serious we are? Decided to throw us a little adventure? Or is this the last surviving clunker on wheels? Does it actually run?" the other added with a smirk. Eva felt as if she'd been spat on repeatedly. The men's amused smiles only made the humiliation sting more. Andy stepped in smoothly. "I apologize, gentlemen. We've had a little unforeseen circumstance. The company car had an accident, and this was the only backup available. We didn't want to disrupt operations by pulling other vehicles off duty. Please forgive the appearance of the car. We'll get you to your destination quickly and comfortably, I promise." And as they set off, Andy continued spinning his story. He claimed that the car was the company's talisman. Eva's father had once driven it back when he was just starting his career and was still very young. That's why the tradition dictated that the car must always be kept running. Eva looked at Andy with gratitude, realizing that he knew quite a bit about her company. He was even aware that her father had founded the chain of stores and started it all from scratch. "That's all right. Honestly, it's an honor for us to ride in the company's talisman." "I think it's a good sign," said Steve, the senior partner, finally ceasing his sarcasm. Even Paul grew quiet. The bad impression from their earlier encounters seemed to dissipate. By the time they arrived, Eva handed Andy a generous tip. "You can't imagine how much you've helped me. And by the way, you were spot on. My dad really did love his old Ford. He kept repairing it to the very end and never bought a better car. See? The key is not giving up. Treat them to a nice hotel, and they'll be fully convinced you respect them and that your business is doing well," Andy advised. "All right. Thanks so much again," Eva said, waving warmly to the taxi driver as he drove off. His support had given her the strength she needed to face the meeting. She had to pull herself together, conduct the negotiations at the highest level possible, and forget about the airport fiasco. It was just emotions, after all. With that resolve, Eva composed herself. The rest of the meeting went relatively smoothly. On her home turf, Eva felt in control, which made things easier. Only once did she feel the ground shift beneath her feet, and that was when Steve, small, wiry, and ever so cutting, asked, "By the way, where's your husband? You've talked so much about him. We'd love to meet the man running the business alongside you." Yes, chimed in Paul, a broad-shouldered brunette. "It's odd that you work together, yet you're handling the negotiations alone. You're not planning a divorce, are you? Of course, it's none of our business, but such things don't reflect well on a business partnership." Eva nearly broke down in tears. She realized it had been a mistake to portray Ronald as almost the head of the company. She should have been straightforward about being the one in charge for the time being. And she shouldn't have asked Ronald to arrange the car either. Her secretary would have done a much better job. Now, on top of everything, Eva had to cover for Ronald's inconsiderate behavior while still reeling from the morning's ordeal. But she had to save the company. They truly were going through tough times, and this deal couldn't afford to fall apart. "Of course," Eva said, steadying her voice. "Ronald, as a real man, shoulders the toughest part, the tactical operations, solving on-the-ground issues. Meanwhile, I handle the strategy. That's why he's constantly out in the field, overseeing production, while I attend meetings, sip coffee, and wear nice suits. I think we've divided our responsibilities perfectly." Eva tried to turn everything into a joke. Steve and Paul laughed, though it was clear they still didn't fully grasp the situation. Eva, on the other hand, felt uncomfortable with all the absurd lies. She disliked lying and covering for anyone, but now she had no choice. Somehow, she managed to steer the conversation away from the topic without sounding entirely foolish. It was like walking on thin ice, and she narrowly avoided falling through. Eva was immensely relieved when the guests left for their expensive hotel in a luxurious car arranged by her secretary. Yet she blushed deeply when Steve couldn't resist a sarcastic remark upon seeing the decent vehicle. "Oh, I see the quest is over, for now, at least with the cars." Paul frowned and added, "We'll see if the accommodations measure up." Eva swallowed her embarrassment and assured them that everything would be fine this time. On her way home, she tried calling Ronald several times, but he only picked up as she was pulling into their driveway. When Eva saw him, the reason became clear. Ronald was visibly tipsy, so much so that he didn't even notice the lipstick marks on his collar. The distinct scent of women's perfume on him was also, apparently, a mystery to him. Ronald tried to put on a brave front, acting as though he had been waiting for her all along. Yet it was obvious he had just arrived. He hadn't even had time to take off his jacket, and his shoes were haphazardly thrown in the hallway, something he would have neatly arranged if he'd had a moment to spare. "Where did you spend the money?" Eva asked, though she knew it was foolish to expect him to admit to any wrongdoing. "I was scammed," Ronald said, launching into a convoluted explanation. He claimed that he had responded to an ad, thinking it was a reputable business car rental service. But then he realized they only had one decent car, and he hadn't recognized the warning signs due to his inexperience. "They stopped answering the phone entirely," Ronald continued. "So, I had no choice but to call for that taxi. That's why I got that guy. He's in such a tough spot with his daughter." Ronald elaborated on a sob story about why he'd hired Andy, portraying it as an act of pity. "Fine," Eva said, "I actually liked that driver myself. He really helped me out. But why didn't you answer my calls? And what's with the lipstick on your shirt? Why do you reek of perfume? And where did you get drunk?" She unloaded a barrage of questions on him. "You see," Ronald stammered, "you were so upset, and I didn't know what to say to explain myself. So, I decided to have a drink for courage. I lost track of time. I felt terrible for letting you down. I know how important this all is." And then, at the bar, this woman of ill repute came over. They hang around places like that. I kept pushing her away, told her I'm married, even showed her my ring. Can you believe it? She left that lipstick mark just to spite me. Such a vindictive woman. Eva could tell Ronald was making it all up. Yet part of her wanted to believe that he hadn't cheated on her. So, she chose not to press him further. "Fine, I'm going to make dinner," she said with a sigh. Who doesn't make mistakes? And even if something did happen, maybe it was just fleeting? Is it worth destroying our family over this? She thought to herself as she headed to the kitchen. Eva sliced onions into rings, but she knew full well that the tears streaming down her face had nothing to do with them. Memories she desperately tried to push away flooded back as she prepared dinner. While chopping other vegetables and preparing the meat for the stew, her mind wandered to her childhood. Her parents had met in an orphanage. Her mother was 5 years older than her father, but to him, she was a queen. For her, he overcame every obstacle. He even convinced one of his wealthier friends to help him start a business. Of course, John. For you, I'd do anything. You saved my life back at the logging camp, Uncle Edward, the benefactor of their family, had once said. Eva, just 10 years old at the time, had heard the story and remembered it vividly. When her father was 16, he and other orphans were sent to do grueling labor under the guise of practical experience. That's where her father met a young convict, Edward. Back then, Edward was brash and reckless. He had a run-in with some hardened prisoners who plotted to quietly kill him by dropping a tree on him during work. But Eva's father overheard their plan and came up with a way to save him. Edward pretended to contract an infection, and to make it believable, John and several other orphans feigned the same symptoms. The resulting panic led to their being sent back to the orphanage to prevent an outbreak. Edward later seemed to turn his life around, staying out of further trouble. However, Eva's mother believed he still associated with questionable people and warned her father to avoid him. John, maybe he's a decent man in his own way, but Edward has chosen his path. We simple, hard-working folks shouldn't get involved with him, Margaret, Eva's mother, had said one evening when Edward offered his help. What else can I do, Margaret? You need treatment, our daughter needs to grow up strong, and my own health isn't great. We have to get by somehow. For Edward, giving me the money is nothing. He won't betray me, her father tried to reason with her. Margaret argued with him for a long time. Then, as always, she started drinking and vented her frustration by yelling and smashing dishes. Margaret's struggles with alcohol were the family's well-kept secret. Neighbors and relatives thought she only drank a little in the evenings to unwind. But the truth was far darker. Margaret drank morning, noon, and night. She never hurt Eva, but her father bore the brunt of her anger. Eventually, Margaret lost her job as a nurse at the hospital. Those aware of their family's troubles often praised Eva's father, calling him a saint for enduring what many couldn't. After all, problematic husbands were common, but a devoted husband shouldering the burden of a troubled wife was a rarity. "I'm just a burden to you. I only make life harder," Margaret would sulk every evening, draining the energy from her husband and daughter. She didn't mean any harm, quite the opposite. She recognized her faults, but her declarations of not wanting to live were the most terrifying part of Eva's young life. Despite everything, they loved her deeply and did everything they could to help her. Her father used to say that everyone was given a different weight to carry and that some could barely bear their own. The final month of Margaret's life remained etched in Eva's memory. Margaret had tried to quit drinking again, this time checking herself into an expensive clinic that her father somehow managed to pay for. Upon returning, she pulled out a sewing machine and started making a dress for Eva. At 14, Eva was astonished. She couldn't remember her mother ever sewing anything for her. But the strangest part wasn't the dress, it was the way Margaret sang while she worked. She seemed genuinely happy, a state Eva hadn't seen in 8 years. "Mom, are you feeling okay?" Eva asked cautiously. As usual, Eva had cooked and cleaned. Though her father was earning a decent salary by then, they couldn't afford to hire help. Household responsibilities fell to her and her father since her mother couldn't manage them. If Margaret attempted anything, it usually ended in another emotional outburst. Most of the time, she berated herself, calling herself useless, or lashed out at her husband, urging him to leave her. "You should just find a normal woman," she'd say. "Stop making a fool of me and don't torture our daughter." But that evening, her mother was different. "I'm making you a dress." "You're so beautiful, my darling," Margaret said, holding up a red fabric against Eva and showing her the pattern. "Mom, maybe you should rest instead?" Eva suggested gently. "No, not this time." "It's time I pulled myself together," Margaret replied firmly. That month was unlike any other. Margaret not only finished sewing the dress, but also prepared all the food for Eva's birthday. She spoke kindly with her husband, often telling him how much she loved him. It was as though she was pouring out all the goodness she had inside, making up for years of silence. Eva and her father were hopeful. People can change, they thought. But just a month later, Margaret passed away. It turned out her liver had been failing, and she had known she didn't have much time left. Her final efforts were a gift to them, a way to be remembered for her best self. Before she died, she admitted as much, saying she wanted them to remember her as the mother and wife she always wished she could be. At the memorial, Eva's father shared, for the first time, the hardships Margaret had endured. When she was just 8, their house burned down. Her father, a reckless drunk, set it on fire. "And Mom?" Eva asked, wide-eyed. Margaret was just a little girl herself, but she pulled her 3 younger brothers out of the fire. She couldn't save her mother, though. She blamed herself for that her whole life. "That's why you never talked about Grandma and Grandpa on her side? And why Mom's brothers never brought it up?" Eva realized aloud. She had always found it strange how conversations fell silent whenever anyone accidentally mentioned Margaret's childhood before the orphanage. Her father's past was much clearer. His mother had him very young, cared for him as long as she could, and eventually left him at the orphanage to give him a chance at survival in their remote village. But her mother's history had been a mystery until now. "Dad, did you love Mom?" Eva asked. "I would have given my life for her," he said without hesitation. "Everything was for Margaret. She was always good. If I could trade places with her right now, I wouldn't think twice." It was the first time Eva saw her father cry, and she understood that true love did exist. Eva hadn't inherited her mother's height or grace. She was petite, brimming with boundless energy. Not a classic beauty, but charming in her own way, with a delicate, well-proportioned figure. When she grew older, she enrolled in an economics program, just as her father had wished. Life without her mother wasn't easier, as she had once naively assumed. Her father seemed to lose his spirit, aging before her eyes. He rushed to hand over the family business to Eva, who realized it would be selfish to pursue her dream of becoming a veterinarian. She owed her father too much for everything he had sacrificed for her. Though she had no desire to become a businesswoman, she gradually took the reins, bit by bit. Her father never complained, but Eva could see he was running on empty. He smiled, but his eyes were hollow. Business wasn't going badly, but nothing seemed to bring him joy anymore. Whenever he had a free moment, he would visit her mother's grave. Eva always went with him, fearing he'd lose track of time and catch his death in the cold. Once, she let him go alone, and it nearly ended in disaster. Many women, young and old, pursued Eva's father. He was a desirable bachelor, financially stable, raising a daughter on his own, and known for being a devoted and honorable man. No one would have turned him down. It's unbelievable. Why do good women always end up with drunks, while the decent ones are left alone? A neighbor grumbled resentfully as Eva's father walked past, heading toward his old Ford, another thing he remained loyal to until his death. She wasn't just a woman, she was the only one for me. There will never be another. Leave me alone, all of you. This was the only time Eva's father had ever responded to someone's indirect advances. Usually, he just walked by without a word, paying no attention. Eva remembered those words vividly and thought to herself that she'd like her future husband to speak about her the same way. Seeing her father deteriorate further, Eva decided it was time to get married and give him a grandchild. Among the many admirers vying for her attention, not only for her charm but also her family's wealth, she chose Ronald. He was lighthearted, cheerful, and kind. Eva thought, if I have daughters, they'll be beautiful like him and inherit my seriousness. There was another reason Eva chose Ronald. His family had no history with the Green Serpent. Eva was deeply afraid her future children might inherit the bad genes from her mother and maternal grandfather. Ronald also won her over with his quiet supportiveness. He didn't try to woo her with flowery words, didn't push for kisses, and never promised the moon. Instead, he would always say, "If you need anything, I'm here. Just call. I can see how hard things are for you, with your father being ill. Don't worry, you won't owe me anything. I'm not some slick-talking guy with ulterior motives." At first, Eva didn't believe him. She thought they were just empty words. But one day, when her father suddenly fell ill, she called Ronald, and he came immediately. He stayed with them at the hospital, handling everything. Another time, when the warehouse watchman quit unexpectedly, Eva asked for his help. Ronald showed up, worked the shift, and made sure nothing went missing. He didn't even ask for payment, though Eva insisted on compensating him. Ronald also often talked casually about having children. He dreamed of daughters but wouldn't have minded sons either. He wanted them to take after Eva. They should be clever like you, independent, knowing exactly where they're headed without needing anyone's approval. And small, adorable, and full of life, just like you. Looking at you makes my heart warm. His words were so genuine that Eva thought, so what if he's just a taxi driver and doesn't reach for the stars? The important thing is that he comes from a good, sober, hard-working family. He's kind and decent. And you don't trade kindness for the unknown. "Dad, I'm getting married," she announced excitedly one day. To whom? Her father asked, suddenly more animated. To Ronald, the one who's always helping us, Eva replied with a smile. "Ah, the one who keeps spinning around you? He finally got what he wanted, huh? Well, it's fine, I guess. I'll ask Edward to look after you if something happens to me." Eva's father clearly wasn't happy with her choice. "Dad, why don't you like Ronald?" Eva asked, surprised. "You can't explain this to a daughter with words," her father replied, avoiding her question. All I'll say is this: don't place too much hope in someone until you've shared a loaf of bread with them. And even then, anything can happen. Still, he came to the wedding. Before that, he gave Eva an apartment. Ronald grumbled about it, saying, "Your dad doesn't trust me. He gave you the apartment before the wedding, as if I were just a temporary husband." Eva was surprised that he paid so much attention to that. She had been sure she would live with Ronald forever, have children, and be happy. She didn't care what was written down or who owned what. But Ronald spent the entire day frowning. Even in the wedding photos, he occasionally looked displeased. Her father, however, appeared happy, telling jokes and saying that he had changed his mind about dying and would wait for grandchildren. But he couldn't keep his promise. Just a few months later, his heart gave out, exactly on the day her mother passed away. Her father never regained consciousness, and Eva's life entered a new phase, one that didn't bring her much joy. Her marriage turned out to be far from the romantic ideal she had imagined. Ronald was a decent man, but shallow and weak. Eva had already suspected a few times that he was cheating on her, though she hadn't caught him in the act. Her mother-in-law, who occasionally visited from the village, said, "Well, what did you expect? A handsome husband is always someone else's too. My father was younger than my mother, earned well, looked great, but never cheated on her. And even after she passed, he never remarried," Eva replied firmly. "Maybe there are 1 in a million like that, but usually, reality is different. Don't make a mountain out of a molehill. Even if he does stray, that's something that happens in every family," sighed her mother-in-law. She had a good relationship with Eva and sincerely hoped they would live happily together. But her focus was more on her son's well-being than on Eva's happiness. The important thing was that her son no longer caused trouble and was living comfortably. To top it all off, Eva discovered that Ronald wasn't just a womanizer but also envious. He constantly reproached her for not telling him how rich her family was. He claimed that before their wedding, he thought her father only owned one small store, but it turned out he had a whole chain. "I wouldn't have married you if I had known. You rich people change husbands like gloves," Ronald would say. "Listen, stop acting like a fool. I didn't hide anything from you. Everyone in the city knew my dad owns a network of stores," Eva retorted. She was getting tired of these games. Ronald liked to pretend he was the poor, miserable guy who had been trapped. Eva had always been upfront with him. Yes, there was some truth to his complaints. When they first met, she had told him she wanted to be a vet and wasn't interested in her father's business. But back then, she didn't know how bad her father's health was. Ronald sabotaged every serious task she gave him. He was always dissatisfied, always lying. Eva began to wonder if his serious demeanor before their marriage had all been an act. She sometimes thought, what if he really is a shallow, hypocritical person who just found a comfortable life? But it couldn't just be a coincidence that he didn't impress her father. Today was one of those days. Eva wondered if it was all worth it. She was carrying the business on her own, which had seriously struggled after her father's death. Meanwhile, Ronald was fooling around, making faces, ignoring her requests, putting her in awkward situations, and spending her money that they didn't have to spare. The soup was already boiling in the pot. The stew in the little pots was almost ready. She had finished chopping the salad. Her hands moved automatically, doing what they had been accustomed to since childhood. Eva looked at Ronald with irritation. He was sprawled on the couch, texting someone on his phone, grinning foolishly. "I need to check who this ungrateful oaf is texting," Eva thought, and pretended to dust the living room. She quietly positioned her makeup mirrors so that she could see the phone screen. "Is the food ready yet?" Ronald didn't even look at her, continuing to type messages with a smug smile. At that moment, Eva's eyes filled with tears of frustration. She saw the conversation. Now there was no doubt where the money for the business vehicle rental had gone. Some sunshine in the messages was praising the necklace her husband had bought her. The mistress wrote that their wild morning rendezvous was just a small reward for such an expensive gift. She sent photos of herself, clad only in lingerie and the gold jewelry. Ronald replied that it wasn't anything special and that there would be many more gifts. He even mentioned that he was thinking of marrying her, as his wife had become boring and no longer inspired him. When I got the message, I knew I had a serious man. With emojis and hearts, Eva couldn't hold back. She snatched the phone from Ronald's hands and threw it on the floor. So this is how it is? You're leaving me, the boring one? And you spent the money on this trinket and ruined things with our business partners? You're a fool. Hey, calm down. What, you've degraded yourself so much that you're spying on me now? You're just a hag. I shouldn't have married you. You're invading my life and disrespecting my personal space, Ronald protested. What? Your life? You live off everything I've provided, you don't work. And when I ask you to do something, you make it worse. You're running around with mistresses, spending money on them. Have you forgotten you live in my apartment? Eva retorted. Well, I figured as much. With rich people, everything is measured by money and square footage. Sorry, madam, for bothering you, a simple man with no land or title. Of course, you can mock me without consequences. That's what the proletariat is for, to be trampled on by the ladies, Ronald snarked. You know what? If that's how it is, go to your sunshine, Eva snapped. When Eva said this, she felt a wave of fear. She thought Ronald would pack his things and leave. And she would be all alone. There wouldn't be a single person around to support her. There wouldn't be any daughters like Ronald either. Her legs buckled, and she sank to the floor next to the couch, where her husband was still lounging royally. She started crying, sobbing. It was a far cry from graceful. Ronald even grimaced at this unappealing sight. How had he ended up with such a simpleton as a wife? But then he thought, there was no guarantee that Julie and other delicate, ethereal beauties would love him without gifts. He wasn't that stupid. Besides, his mother had told him during her last visit, "You've got a good woman. If you let her go, don't come back home, you hear me?" His mother had even tapped his nose in a way that felt almost like a lesson. She reminded him of how his father had disappeared, and now here he was, wandering from one place to another, never truly accepted by her. She'd never forgiven him for that. Don't repeat that fate. I didn't go into details about your father, but you better not let me down. Who else needs you, Moth? You just flutter around looking for an easy life, she sighed. All of this came back to Ronald, and he thought, yes, it really would be unpleasant to leave this cozy apartment, run out of money, and have to grovel before his mother. And losing Julie? That, too. No, he definitely needed to stick around for a while. If something fell apart, he could always leave then. He looked at his wife once more. She wasn't so bad, even attractive. If only she wouldn't blow things out of proportion. The car wasn't the right one, she had no mistresses, and there were so many complaints. Oh well. He'd have to put up with it. Ronald climbed down from the couch and sat next to her on the floor, wrapping his arms around her thin, trembling shoulders. Listen, I'm just upset that I'm not enough for you. I'll get rid of the mistress, I won't see her anymore. You'll see, everything will be fine between us. Just have my kids, ones that look like you. It feels empty without them. You know, not everything is measured by money, Ronald said softly, gently. When he mentioned children, Eva stopped crying and thought for a moment. That was always the trick, talking about having kids. Her husband knew exactly which button to push. First, he made her feel guilty for measuring everything in terms of money. Eva had let off steam. Now, he needed to apologize and dream about a family. The conflict was smoothed over. I want to believe you, but I can't, she said, looking into his eyes, sniffling like a child. Well, everyone deserves a second chance, don't they? Do you still love me, even just a little? Ronald knew the answer would be positive. Yes, but it hurts, Eva admitted. Well, then believe me. All of this will be behind us. "I'll be a different person," Ronald reassured her. Once, in her childhood, Eva had heard similar words from her mother many times, but nothing ever changed, except for the last month of her mother's life. Still, she longed to believe the person she loved. He's right about some things. Not everything is measured in money. It's time to have children, otherwise this family will never feel complete, Eva thought, pressing herself against her husband almost against her will. She knew she should punish him, stop talking to him, but she couldn't do it. She was too afraid of losing him. And not just him, but the whole picture of a happy future that she had dreamed of. It just so happened that she envisioned Ronald as the father of her family. The next morning, Ronald, having prepared breakfast for her, said that nothing had happened yet with Julie. Yes, he had tried to woo her, but it hadn't gone beyond photos. "You know, I'm even thankful that you straightened me out in time. I got off with just a small scrape. The fling didn't go any further. I wouldn't have forgiven myself for that betrayal," Ronald said dramatically. Eva didn't respond. She doubted her husband's words and planned to seize the moment when she could carefully review all the messages. What if this girl really had only tried to seduce him? Maybe it was just a provocation. Her thoughts were consumed by her husband. But she should have been paying attention to Steve and Paul. They were discussing strange details during the negotiations that had nothing to do with the matter at hand. For example, the profitability of the entire business and whether it could survive without Eva. They hinted that they would eventually like to buy him out or even take over if the owner couldn't recover the money invested in the chain of stores. Eva just nodded. She thought that since she hadn't signed any exploitative contracts, everything seemed under control. When the deal stage was over, she felt satisfied. Thanks to the money invested by Steve and Paul, they would manage for some time, and after that, who knew? Business was unpredictable. If today's problems were solved and tomorrow's weren't yet created, that was already something. That's how her father used to say. "Should I get you a car to the airport?" Eva asked as she was saying goodbye. "No, we'll call a taxi," her partner smiled. "Well, maybe it's for the best. Seems like I have bad luck with cars." Eva decided to end this stage of the negotiations with a light, non-intrusive joke and, at the same time, apologize once more for any inconvenience. She left her partners at the hotel and didn't notice that, by fate's hand, the very same rattletrap car had been called again. Of course, Andy was the driver. Well, it's obvious that this lady is having a tough time. There's trouble with her husband, and money's tight. "And that's good for us," Steve said in the car. Andy flinched. He immediately recognized these people, whom he had driven a few days ago. Are they talking about that woman who gave the tip? He wondered to himself and decided to listen closely, not showing any signs that he was interested. "Yes, we just need to take over this company. We'll organize a regular hostile takeover. It's clear that Eva can't hold her own. Her father built the business, but she can't handle it. Her husband is just spineless," Paul said. "But we can't do everything ourselves. We've got a reputation to uphold. If rumors start spreading, how will we be able to trick other naive people later on?" Sighed Steve. "What about Edward? You know he's an authority. He could cause some trouble for the right price." "Everything will be covered up," said Paul. "Yeah, but he's a strange guy with his own way of doing things. What if he refuses? What if he causes us trouble?" "There are all kinds of rumors about him," Steve countered. "True. Edward is unpredictable, but there's no one else to turn to. He's the most reliable option. You don't want to end up behind bars, do you?" Paul asked. "No, of course not." "All right, you're right. We'll contact him," Steve replied quietly. When they reached the airport, Steve gave the taxi driver a generous tip, saying, "If you hear anything, keep your mouth shut." "I don't know much, I was just listening to music," Andy said. "Good, keep it that way, and you'll go far," Paul said approvingly, patting the taxi driver on the shoulder. When the men got out of the car, Andy felt a surge of anger. How he wanted to hit those arrogant faces. They even gave him money as though he were some kind of traitor. Of course, he would warn the woman immediately. Andy drove to the office where he had dropped her off last time. He remembered the address. "What are you doing here?" He ran into Ronald in the lobby. They used to have good relations, but now Ronald spoke to him condescendingly, as if they had nothing in common anymore. "I need to pass something to Eva," Andy said. "Friend, I helped you out back in the day. I called you knowing you needed help. But that doesn't mean you get to mess with my wife." "Get out of here and leave her alone," Ronald said sharply. Ronald didn't like this strange desire from his former colleague to talk to Eva. Who knew what she was saying to him? What could possibly connect them? "Fine, I'll just use the bathroom," Andy said, pretending to head that way, but secretly writing a note and leaving it with the secretary. He said it was very important and needed to be passed on to the boss. The secretary looked at the poorly dressed man in surprise, but promised to fulfill his request. Andy left, unaware that Ronald hadn't gone anywhere. He continued to watch him. He saw Andy pass the note, then approach the secretary. "Hand it over." "I'm going to see Eva now, I'll give it to her." "Maybe it's urgent," Ronald said. The secretary nodded nervously. She had just started working there and didn't want to upset the boss's husband, so she just handed over the note. Ronald went outside and read the crumpled paper. He couldn't believe his eyes. What luck! Andy was warning his wife that the partners were actually dangerous. They wanted to take her business. And he was ready to meet in person and tell her all the details of the conversation he had overheard. "No, bro, thanks. I'll manage without the details." "I get the point, even without a degree," Ronald muttered to himself, grinning. Suddenly, he realized fate had unexpectedly extended a hand of help. There was no need to tolerate his wife for much longer. Ronald would simply meet with these so-called partners and ask for a payoff. In return, he'd help sink Eva and take her business. And of course, he wouldn't tell anyone about it. This way, he'd have the money for Julie and other similar beauties. No more begging, lying, or humiliating himself. Maybe he'd even have enough for his own place. Now that's what he called beauty. Ronald became excited by the idea. He immediately went back to the reception and told the secretary, "My wife asked me to urgently call our partners. Give me their phone number." "Don't you think you should check with the boss first?" The secretary timidly replied. "Do you know how hard it is to find a good job in this town?" Ronald asked, boldly. The secretary nodded shyly and wrote the numbers down on a piece of paper. She didn't want any problems, she had just barely managed to get this job. Ronald walked into his wife's office, sat down in her chair, put his feet up on the desk, and immediately called Steve and Paul, presenting what he thought was his brilliant plan. We're glad you're on our side. But where did you get this information from?" Steve asked. "Well, that's my secret." "Money up front," Ronald replied. He decided not to back down. Let them know he was confident. That way, they'd give him more money. "All right, we'll think about your offer," Steve answered. "Wait, you're just going to think about it? What if I tell my wife everything?" "You have 24 hours to think it over," Ronald said. He remembered a line from a movie where a confident businessman said something similar and decided to try the same thing. It worked in the movie, so why wouldn't it work for him? "Oh, don't be so nervous. It's just that the sum is substantial. We need to gather the money," Steve replied. "Ah, I see. You should have said that right away, but remember, one day," Ronald repeated. He felt like these people were on his hook, even trembling before him. Setting up Eva would be a piece of cake. She was so naive. Then he could live happily without any problems and without answering to anyone. Youth only comes once. Ronald was very pleased with himself, but he had no idea that at that very moment, Steve and Paul had decided to pay off a local authority to not only sink Eva but also to somehow neutralize her foolish and overly active husband. Meanwhile, Eva had returned to the office after visiting the stores. The security guard reported to her, "Oh, you're back. A strange person was here, leaving you a note. Your husband was going to give it to you." "What kind of person?" Eva looked at the surveillance cameras and gasped. Why had Andy come to her office? This was truly unexpected. She walked into the room where her husband was waiting and casually said, "Someone left me a note?" "Oh, yeah. The accountant said she'd be an hour late tomorrow," her husband lied, blurting out the first thing that came to mind. Eva decided not to argue. She was starting to understand that he lied often, if not always, so she said she needed to go out on business. Meanwhile, she found Andy's phone number, which he had given her in case she needed anything in return for the tip, and suggested they meet. "Okay. I'll finish the order first. Where should I come?" "Let's meet somewhere neutral," Eva suggested a nearby cafe. 40 minutes later, Andy arrived. He was relieved that the note had actually been delivered to her. Eva decided not to inquire further into the details. After all, it was her family's matter, and she didn't want to talk about it. "So, that's it. My business is going to be taken away?" They pretended to be respectable partners. "I even checked them against the database, couldn't find anything wrong," Eva sighed. "Well, that's the way things are now. Many people aren't who they seem," Andy agreed with her and offered to help in any way he could. "If you want, I can go see this authority. I'll explain everything. They say he's not as ruthless as they make him out to be." "Yeah, the situation is complicated," Eva replied. She couldn't understand why her husband hadn't told her anything about this. She needed to figure that out. She was stuck between two fires, the raiders and the authority. Or maybe between 3 fires. If Ronald also wanted to betray her. "Well, anyway, call me anytime, I'll try to help." Though my resources aren't all that great, Andy offered again, and from his expression, Eva understood it wasn't just empty words. In fact, he was taking a significant risk by telling her all this, and he had refused any reward, even though Ronald had mentioned his tough situation with his daughter. And money, in general. "Thank you. I'll need to think everything over. This all came at me so suddenly, but I really appreciate your help." With those words, Eva said goodbye. At the same time, Steve and Paul were talking to a short, mustached man in his 60s. He was frowning, looking tense. "Edward, how can we manage without your help?" Steve asked pitifully, referring to their past successful cooperation. "Listen, let's be clear. It's one thing when a thief steals a club from another thief, and quite another to take the last from a woman. I only fight with men, those from our circle. So don't count on me for this. The conversation is over." Edward stood up and gestured for them to leave the office. Steve and Paul understood that it was better not to wait until they were kicked out altogether. Joking around with the authority figure was a bad idea. They ran out like scalded cats. But who would have thought Edward would turn out to be such a delicate person? Paul grumbled. "Looks like we'll have to turn to that fool, Eva's husband, even though I really don't want to," Steve sighed. Both of them agreed that there was no other option. They dialed Ronald's number. The very next day, Ronald told his wife, "You look kind of pale. By the way, a friend of mine bought a country hotel. He's offering us to stay there for free. We can check out the service and also help him out. What do you think?" "Who's this friend?" "I thought you didn't have any rich friends," Eva asked, eyeing him suspiciously. But with her husband's innocent expression, she thought there was nothing wrong with it. After all, he wasn't going to hurt her like in the movies. Ronald was a different person. He might lie, but he wasn't dangerous. And she needed a change of scenery to think through the difficult situation. Plus, she could find out why Ronald hadn't told her about the note. By the way, I should call Andy just in case, she suddenly thought. She did call the taxi driver and told him where she was going with her husband. "I don't think it's a good idea for you to go anywhere," Andy tried to object. He even offered to drive them, given the circumstances. "Don't worry, we'll stay in touch." "And thanks for helping," Eva said. It made her feel a little better knowing Andy would know where she was. 2 days passed, and Eva still hadn't been in touch. Andy went to the hotel, but found out she hadn't even arrived there. So, he went to her office, where they told him that the boss was taking the weekend off. "Did she call herself?" Andy asked the secretary. "No, but her husband asks about her every day," the girl replied. Eva Clark's disappearance seemed strange to her, but she didn't want to get involved in family matters. That's what she told the taxi driver. "Well, I guess there's nothing else to do. I'll have to go to this authority. I probably won't come back from there, but there's no other way. Let him know I couldn't keep the dark dealings hidden." Everyone's turned against the woman, Andy thought as he drove in his clunker. Of course, the security wouldn't let him in, and they were about to give him a good beating. But just then, the owner of the mansion came out. "Who's this brave soul, showing up here?" Andy's heart skipped a beat from the smirk on the mustached man's face, but there was no turning back now. He had nothing to lose. "And don't think you can just kill Eva Clark. It won't go unpunished. I know about your collusion with Steve and Paul, and I won't stop at anything. I've already left information in the press," Andy shouted in desperation. He had no connections in the media. He said this just to leave himself and Eva a tiny chance of survival. Yes, it was strange, but for some reason, this almost unknown woman mattered to him. Just like he mattered to her and to his daughter. "Why do you care about Eva? Who are you anyway?" Edward asked with a smile, and for some reason, he gestured for his guards to release the guest. The guards even politely invited him to have some tea or something stronger, as they put it. Once in the office, Andy told the whole story from the beginning. Edward listened and then replied, "Since we're on this subject, I'll confess, I'm actually Eva's godfather. Her father saved my life back when I was young. Our paths eventually parted. I ended up in a place you know well, and he became an honest, though not very wealthy businessman. I kept an eye on Eva as best I could. I refused the offer from those ruffians, and yet they still kidnapped her. Good thing you came." Edward explained that he hadn't wanted to interfere. He thought the raiders wouldn't take further action. But something needs to be done, urgently. "She's in danger," Andy cried. "Easy there, you're too hot-headed." "Well, I suppose you're right," Edward said, looking at him with the gaze of an old dragon, hundreds of years old. Yet, strangely, there was a trace of sympathy in his eyes. He called for his men and gave them instructions. By evening, Eva was found in a small cabin in the forest near the country complex. "Good thing that fool didn't turn off his phone," Edward's assistant said about Ronald, adding that her husband had conspired with the raiders and helped kidnap his wife. In reality, Eva thought that both she and Ronald had been tied up. Steve and Paul pretended they were going to kill her husband if she didn't sign the papers. And when Eva signed everything, they just ditched Ronald, left him tied up. What an idiot! The burly men laughed. That same evening, the raiders were arrested. They were clearly told that if they didn't want to spend a long time in prison, they needed to hand over the signed documents. Edward kept his promise, so they weren't detained on that charge. However, the old dragon was crafty and devious. The very next day, Steve and Paul were hit with another, more serious charge, but it seemed like Edward had nothing to do with it. The poor guys never found out that they tried to take down the wrong woman's company. Ronald received a suspended sentence, but his worst punishment was that Eva left him not a single penny out of principle. And before it all ended, she said, "Maybe your Julie will sell what you gave her. You have such an ethereal love. How could we, ordinary people, understand such high matters?" The mistress, of course, had no intention of doing anything like that. By that time, she had already found someone more promising and was even planning to get married. Ronald had to crawl to his mother in shame, but she wouldn't feed him. She arranged for him to work as a tractor driver for her brother. The job turned out to be too difficult, and Ronald was fired. He had no choice but to become a cowherd. There, the women kept an eye on him to make sure he didn't slack off. His mother worked there too, so he couldn't slack off. Those who didn't work didn't eat. That was how Ronald began his path to redemption. "Edward, why didn't you tell me earlier that my father had tasked you with watching over me?" Eva asked. She hadn't known that her godfather was a criminal authority. She thought he just ran a small business and helped through his connections, as Andy had explained. "Well, as they say, do good and throw it into the water. I didn't want to show off. And Andy's a good guy. You should take a closer look." "I've got a good eye," Edward said with a smile. Eva blushed. Edward saw it as a good sign. Probably, something was brewing. By the way, he had also done his part. He paid for Andy's daughter's operation. After all, if it hadn't been for this brave little sparrow with a big heart, he wouldn't have known that Eva was in trouble. So he had to help, no matter what. "I just helped, that's all," Andy said. "Listen, don't kid me. Take what's given. You need to think about your daughter. And about your future wife." Edward enjoyed noticing how the young man became seriously embarrassed. He thought, this naive young generation. They think no one can see the sparks between them, which are about to turn into a flame. And maybe even a steady, lifelong fire. Edward didn't tell Andy right away that he had already arranged for him to upgrade his car and apartment in a couple of months. Otherwise, he would start refusing again like a young lady. But Edward wasn't concerned about him. He understood Eva's situation. Edward's instincts were right. 6 months later, Eva and Andy got married, and soon after, their twin daughters were born. They looked a lot like John, Edward's friend. Vicky also built a good relationship with Eva. And so, a young but already large family was formed. Eva's business didn't grow very quickly, but it still brought in some profit. She didn't want to chase after unreachable dreams. A bird in the hand was worth much more. She often thought that the old pumpkin of a Ford had indeed turned into a carriage, and the taxi driver had turned into her prince. At least for Eva and Andy, it was a true miracle of mutual love and family happiness. If you enjoyed the story, please support it with a like and a comment. All the best to you.